Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our latest live learning session. We are thrilled to be bringing, I think, a really important conversation to the table today around how we design schools with teacher and student wellbeing at the core of what's important to us. I just want to kick off by, I guess, something that's really important to me, which is acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we live, work, and play. And for those that have sort of joined us before, you'll know that I've got sort of a fairly common way of doing this, in which I normally show a map of Australia and then show our map of our Indigenous nations and the fabric that kind of knits Australia together. And so I guess today I really want to pause for a moment before we dig into this conversation and really honour our First Nations people, particularly as these conversations that we have about innovation and next and new, we need to acknowledge that our traditional owners were, the first teachers and the first entrepreneurs and the first innovators. And so going back to the rich history and culture, I think, of our First Nations people is integral to designing really purposeful solutions moving forward. So I'm coming to you from Brisbane, from Yagara and Turrbal land, and I would love it if you would take a second to drop into the chat where you're coming to us from. So let us know whose lands you're living, working and playing on, and sort of take some time to drop that in the chat so that we can see where everybody is joining us from. As you will have seen, we're recording today's session. So if that's an issue, just make sure that we keep your camera off so that you're not on screen. We love to send these recordings out to those that can't make it live so that this important and rich conversation, I think, can be shared with those that can't quite be present in this particular moment in time. If you haven't already, just jump into the video settings, like next to the camera, and just make sure that you've switched off hide non-video participants, and that way you'll see sort of that full screen experience as well, which is really important. Now, today's conversation, as I said, I think is a critical one, and I kind of was chatting to our guests a moment ago about where we were going into with this conversation. And I felt like for me, my first role in schools was actually as head of a pastoral care program. And this was, a decade ago when I think pastoral care programs in schools were just sort of coming into effect. In Queensland in particular, we'd just created sort of year level coordinator roles, and certainly schools were looking at embedding pastoral care lines, specifically in the junior school, to kind of tackle the things that perhaps weren't being addressed by curriculum. And so my first role was to kind of map this 7 to 12 space, this one lesson a week, and then build the capacity of educators to deliver, hopefully, a real world curriculum that kind of tapped into things like wellbeing and health, and all of the, I guess, moving parts that sometimes we assume students know about, but maybe they don't. And so I remember being really daunted by the process then. And certainly I think this space has evolved significantly, particularly in the pastoral care that we run within schools for young people. Today's conversation is kind of going to talk about that, how we build schools with wellbeing for students at the core. But a particular layer that I want to bring to this conversation is how we design schools with teacher wellbeing, with the same level of importance as our student wellbeing, because we know that when we've got well and happy educators, we have well and happy classrooms, and the connection between these two things is really important. I'm super thrilled to invite our two guests, and I'll get them to turn their cameras on now so that you can see their faces. I'm not going to do them disservice by introducing them by their bios, but they're both educators that I'm fortunate to know through a few different spaces, both personally and professionally. And I'm a huge admirer of both of their work. Louka, why don't you start, and we'll, as Nicola jumps on screen, and I'd love for you to maybe just give us a bit of a brief intro to you. How would you describe yourself in 3 minutes or less? Challenge accepted.
Challenge accepted. Nina Mani, Ghana Yata Ghana Miona Ngadlu Tampanthi. I'm on the beautiful Ghana land here in South Australia. It's where I grew up, and I want to pay my respects to elders. And all the ideas that I share, my own journey in education in less than 3 minutes, Nick, has been deeply informed by First Nations knowledge. I started as an educator 15 hours away from Adelaide in the Anangu Pitjantjatjara Yankunytjatjara lands, which are in the Central Desert. And so I went out there to try to make a difference as a passionate young teacher, And of course, as is so often the way, I learned far more than I think I contributed. And that was as much about how the design of education works for some, but not for all. And frankly, this idea that we've all inherited a system that was designed for a past paradigm, for an era that doesn't exist anymore. And so all the work that I do today really is about how do we redesign all of our social systems, in particular schools and educational environments. So yeah, middle school teacher by training, drama, PE, English, modern Greek, Spanish were my all of my kind of topics. And then going out into a bush school, which was birth to year 12, taught everything and all year levels over that. So, you know, completely ill-equipped for some of the teaching experiences that I had. But certainly what was so obvious to me working alongside Anangu, which is the cultural group of that particular part of Australia with thousands of generations of ongoing connection with country, is just how obvious it was that what I was trying to teach came from a very specific paradigm, one that was focused on the cognitive obsession that is embedded into the way we design schools. Michael Fullan talks about this as an academic obsession, the bloodless paradigm. And so therein began my journey, which continues to this day, about how do we elevate the other dimensions of what make us truly human. And so I do a lot of work in this field of social and emotional learning and well-being more broadly. Co-founded a non-profit that's based in Austria, that's a global alliance builder for social and emotional learning organizations and change makers. Was lucky to work alongside Nick for a period of years as well, you know, supporting the development of agency and innovation capabilities within educators themselves, and now spend a lot of time trying to visit the future and then return to the present. And in that sense, like, what do we do today that enables us to set up ourselves and our young people to really thrive into this uncertain world? So that's a summary of me. I became passionate about languages, clearly. I grew up being monolingual as a first, the first in my family to be born in Australia, and now speak a number of different languages. That for me seemed to be a really powerful way to connect with what makes us human, which is, you know, our sense of identity and contribution. So very excited to be here. Nick, thanks for the invitation, and great to be chatting as well with Nicola.
I'm going to dig into Nicola's story in a second, but I do want to pause because you touched on your work with Karanga, which is an interesting piece given that it's a global alliance that's specifically speaking to that social emotional space. Can you talk to that particular piece of work? Because I know that's been one that's been really important to you. Why did, I guess, this group of, I think, you know, very incredible educators come together to carve out this particular space, and what does that movement look like for you guys moving forward as well?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Karanga means a call out in welcome. It's part of a traditional welcoming ceremony from the Māori, the First Nations of Aotearoa, New Zealand, in English. And so really that's what it has been. What we realized, I went to a global think tank in Salzburg, and what we discovered is there's all these great organizations doing this work, but there was no real convening organization intermediary where, you know, the leaders of these organizations could come together. I don't want to rattle off a number of acronyms because it gets into acronym bingo, but so many of these global organizations, you know, CASL, CFC, UNESCO, UNICEF, the OECD, you know, all these great organizations doing this work, foundations supporting it. So we just thought, well, let's actually become a bit of a glue, a conduit that can really push this agenda into the policymaking sphere in particular. So the OECD, this is of interest, I think, Nick, just released their first study into social and emotional skills. It's 10 years in the making. Koji Miyamoto, who's now with the World Bank, was kind of one of the architects of that alongside Andreas Schleicher. And so my personal view, to sum this up, Nick, is that we are at this kind of the cliff edge where we might be able to redesign by changing the way that we credential and the curriculum, the pedagogy, the leadership, our own initial teacher education that we've all experienced. Maybe we can redesign it to elevate the social and the emotional alongside the cognitive. This is not about losing rigor and not caring about literacy and numeracy, but it's about changing the framing of what it means to be a school and what success is for a school. It's not our ATAR, it's not the number. It's how we feel, how we think, how socially connected we are, and a whole range of these other dimensions that actually make us truly human. And what's pleasing is we've got industry as well, and this is your work in particular, Nick. It's like we've got future of work. Industry are now completely on board with this message. They might use the word soft skills, but increasingly we know that these are the core competencies that will enable us to be well, to think well, and hopefully to do well.
Thank you for I guess glossing over a big body of work in a really short period of time. And I know we're going to dig into a few other pieces in a moment. What's really cool about this conversation is that, everybody in the room was an educator in the classroom at one point and is now leading work for educators, but outside of that space. And Nicola, the first time I saw you speak about the work that you're leading now, I was completely captured by that origin story for you, being in the classroom, and I guess what prompted you to make that leap outside of the classroom. I'd love for you to dig into a little bit of that now. Tell us a little bit about you as the teacher, and then what you're doing now, and kind of what was the bridge between that.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole, for that introduction. So very briefly, a classroom teacher for 12 years in Brisbane high schools, and a classroom teacher with a public health background. So I had my public health goggles on every time I walked into the classroom, and I'd see this classroom full of kids as a mini version of the population. And so my Master of Public Health was majoring in epidemiology. So I had concern for the burdens on society in terms of health. And so as a teacher, I started to notice that these young people aren't learning, and that was really frustrating to me as a young teacher. They weren't learning because they weren't well. And so coming from a public health background, I considered that there was something missing here. These kids were coming in quite dysregulated, and cognitively they weren't able to engage in what we were learning. I approached my principal at the time, and at the time I was teaching in a school that was steeped in history and tradition, and I was, I'd sort of been teaching.
Sounds like barriers.
Yes,
when I hear those words, blockers.
And
tradition.
Maybe I'd been teaching for about 8 years, so I thought I was still quite fresh, and I hadn't had any leadership experience at that time. I had lots of self-doubt, as we all do, and I approached my principal and I said, in frustration, there's something missing here. What is it? Every, say, a 50-minute period, I have, for example, 10 one-minute episodes of redirecting behavior. That was on a good day in a good classroom. And so I proposed that, there's 10 minutes there that I lose teaching. Can I have those 10 minutes at the start of the period and offer young people mindfulness meditation as a way of regulating social and emotional reaction from the playground, from their peers? And it was incredible. I'll just say that. And the research was born out of that, and whether or not this mindfulness meditation, stopping, pausing, breathing, training the attention muscle of the brain, whether that had an impact on learning was the overarching question. And so I had 200 Year 9 students over the course of a full year undertake this research, where they built up from an initial 4 minutes of sitting still with mind, guidance and breath, and they worked their way up to about, we had days where we would have 20 minutes out of a 90-minute period. And what happened after the exposure to that mindfulness meditation was their brains were open to learning, they were regulated, they were engaged. So I guess my journey started at acknowledging and noticing that young people were at risk of disengaging from school completely because they were, stuff going on at home, possibly stuff going on with their peers, the world at large. And from a teaching point of view, it was heartbreaking. These young people were, some of them, diagnosed with mood disorders at 12 years old, and that wasn't good enough for me. So I went about changing it, and now I that's what I do when I'm in schools with young people and with teachers. I offer that deliberate time and space to just be.
So tell us a little bit more about now, because the work that you do with Sound Off for Schools is actually quite interesting, and I know that it's diverse depending on the school that you're working with. But can you sort of take us through maybe a couple of ways that you work with schools to kind of bring in this mindfulness, this meditation, this space for young people and teachers as
Yeah,
well?
yeah. So let's say the majority of work that I do, let's just say in Australia, we are leaders in mental health research, but not in practice. So still, it's early days. The majority of work I do is very one-off. Let's say, if you like the term bolt on, we come in for a retreat day, we offer sessions at the end of the term for teachers when they're just exhausted, and the school is saying, oh, we're giving you this gift of 1 hour to do some breathing and yoga. So it's still very much like that, but there are these schools in Queensland that are, they're movers and shakers, because from design, so I've been lucky enough to work with some new schools of late. From design, they are putting it into their timetable, and it's a non-negotiable, and typically it's 2 times a day, 5 minutes in the morning and after lunch. And so that version of what I do is called a plug and play, where teachers have access to the recording and they simply plug it in and play it. And that kind of, that way of practicing this skill is, it's more effective, if you like, because it's a practice over time and it's consistent. But as you can imagine, there are so many barriers to that in many schools.
Yeah, super interesting. I'm going to dig back into the research side of that in a second, but I want to broaden our focus for a moment. The sort of, I guess, that first role that I had leading pastoral care in schools, I remember having to like create the wellbeing program from the ground up. There certainly wasn't, there were the emerging organisations that were working to support in this space, but ultimately the schools that were looking to embark on this journey were kind of having to write the story or build the plane as they were flying it in many ways. We're a little bit further along that journey now. I'd love to know, in both of your experiences, and maybe I'll start with you, Louka, what are some examples of some schools that are doing some really interesting work in the wellbeing space, where they're designing their school with wellbeing at the core, rather than kind of what Nicola talked about, which is kind of tacking it on the outside in the hope that it'll address a problem?
That's such a great question, Nick. And it's great that Greg Miller just jumped on, because we did some work with St. Luke's last year. You know, and the idea, how do you design when you're a foundation principal like Greg is? I mean, it's an enormous challenge and an enormous opportunity, because you don't need to reculture the school. You can build from the beginning. And so I would defer to the people doing the work to really talk about that a bit. The thing I would offer is that we are obsessed with this programmatic approach, which is, let's get the program in and the program will solve the problem. For me, the programmatic approach is step 1 of maybe 3 steps, right? The program exists to shift and become practices. And so this is the whole idea. People are unaware of something. You do an intervention, and then people understand the practices. Great. Okay, cool. So we can take a mindful moment or a meta moment, or we can practice some, mindful meditation or loving kindness meditation, whatever the practice might be. The point is, we almost want the program to dissolve into, this is the new fabric of how the organization self-regulates at that organizational level. So, I mean, there's lots. I mean, Nicolas is a great example. Sound Off for Schools is like, it's a program that works. There's lots of examples of this, but again, the challenge I see is that we haven't yet centered them into the design at the educational system level yet. And I think largely that's because of how we define success. You know, are young people asked how they feel? What is their overall level of well-being as they exit school after 13 years? No, broadly not. What are we judged on as educators and as school systems? On the academic outcomes, which matter hugely, but they're not a life well lived. So some of my work with Learning Creates Australia in particular is trying to shift the recognition system so that it recognizes the things that we all know as educators are very important. And if we ask our young people, for them is critically important. 1 in 4 young people developing a mental health challenge before they turn 18. I think the statistic as well that you spoke about, Nick, it's 30% in any given year, you know, and so there seems to be some work to go on that. I can talk to some other global interesting things happening across system levels, but I'll pause there because I think this is a really kind of practical question is, what do we do rather than having to build from the beginning? Clearly, there's, instead of all starting from scratch, it's taking great work that already exists, bringing that in and adapting to our context.
Nicola, anything that you can add from obviously like, and we can, I think, as you've said, like we can definitely dip into that system stuff, which I think we should in a moment. But speaking to your experience on the ground with schools, like what are some really tangible examples that you've seen of schools doing student wellbeing broadly, like really well?
To put an umbrella over it, I would say when it's done well, it's deliberate. It's not reactive. So I acknowledge and I understand, and very recently Queensland has shifted towards having a school chaplain in most schools, and that's wonderful that resource is there for, you know, at-risk kids, but it's a reactive way to respond to the well-being of young people. So when I see it done well, I see it done from the beginning. It's a non-negotiable of the day, and it's part of, as Louka said, it's part of the fabric of the school. It's like marking the role. It's just something that's done each day, so it creates a habit and also an environment of peace and calm and regulation. And the only other experience I've had where it's groundbreaking, I was lucky enough to work with the new Fortitude Valley State College, which it's unusual because it's an urban school and it's a vertical school, so it's a high-rise school, and up to 44% of these student enrollments, these young people live in apartments. So this is an unusual, atypical demographic, and the leadership team acknowledged this, and that these young people come from small spaces and they come from chaotic spaces, inner city, lots of traffic, lots of noise, lots of sensory stimulation. So part of the design of their school is to have this audio where the kids wear wireless headphones, which is what our program is, to create space. So it's not extra physical space, it's closed eyes, it's space in the mind to draw back inward to find space within, and to acknowledge that this human experience that we're all having can be messy sometimes, and we have tools to clear the mess so we can learn.
Super interesting. I want to dig a little bit further, and Louka, I might get you to jump in here. I think, Nicola, what you talked about then is really interesting in talking about the general chaos of life, and perhaps the labeling we have around wellbeing programs is kind of this explicit instruction around like, this is what mental health is. And when you were talking, what was really resonating for me is just that notion of how many different types of rest and well-being there is that exist. You know, things like sensory rest, and obviously like physical rest, and we talk about sleep, and like there are a multitude of components that sit around like health and well-being, of which often we only address a portion of at best, perhaps in our education system. Louka, in the work that you're doing, like, can you talk to some of like the parts or pieces that schools should be thinking about building into wellbeing programs? What sort of stuff do young people need to know about, and also educators, in order to think about this, you know, massive concept of mental health and wellbeing?
Gee, that's a simple question, Nick.
Yeah, if you could just wrap it up really.
Let me put that in a bow.
Yeah.
I'll
Some of the pieces. You don't even have to cover all of them.
I'll speak to the principle and then
Yeah.
So for me, it's really about what makes us truly human, right? What are the dimensions, we'll call them dimensions, that we should focus on? And like, I would make a strong case that we have just been so dominated by cognition that it's just been about what we think. And actually, we are emotional beings that think, not thinking beings that feel, right? And so how then do we focus on our emotional state and what's happening now? How then do we focus on our social dimension, i.e. the social connectedness and relatedness that we have in our lives, particularly as we've got a loneliness epidemic going on, compounded by COVID. And then we can bring in the physical. Well, actually, are we moving enough in our day? Physical aspects, we know that no high school should really be starting before 9:30, maybe 10 a.m. The adolescent brain reverts to a late chronotype, and yet we're asking them to get up at 5 in the morning. And really, that's anti-scientific, but it suits the industrial paradigm, which we've all inherited as educators and actually just as citizens of a capitalist society, right? And then there's the spiritual element as well, right? And depending on your own spiritual tradition, which might be religious or other, or secular or atheist, there's still something about this piece, which is well-being to me isn't just rest. It's not just, stepping away so that you can take time off, which is think about this conception, right? Oh, I had a day off yesterday. What do you mean? You connected with your family? You walked in nature? How is that time? That seems to be time on. Again, it's like, how do we conceptualize what our role is as educators, as leaders, as learners? So that's the conceptual frame. We need to think about all those different dimensions. Pretty well, Nick, you would know this. In every single session that I ever do now, I effectively do a life wheel, which is how's your sleep? Use the vitality pyramids: sleep, exercise, nutrition. Great. Then you bring in the psychology, positive emotions, engagement, relationships, achievement, accomplishment, a bit of the PERMA stuff from Seligman. I think that's, if we designed around that from a core, I think we have a very different type of learning environment and learning experiences that are within that environment. So that's the conceptual piece, right? It's philosophy first, and then that will manifest as practices that come from us as the educators themselves, right? It's like, what's the hidden grammar, to use that word, that we don't speak about, but that we know this is important and this is not. Do you get a positive grade if you engage in more mindfulness practice? I don't know of any school doing that, and nor should we start to grade and therefore bring the competitive paradigm into that world. But there is this idea that we need to just pay more attention to it, because the way we're going is not going to solve us. We don't need more knowledge, we need more wisdom. And I think Nicola has spoken to this, not more doing, but more being, and actually transcending that completely. The line that I always reflect on, Nick, is, and this is up there, I think, of the entrepreneurship movement, of which you and I are both part, and I think Nicola as well, I'll add you into this group. It's the hustle, the grind, you got to do the stuff, right? It's this obsession with the doing, and that it shouldn't be joyful. It should be painful. And so I wonder, it's not what we know. It's not a knowledge economy. It's not what we do with what we know, which is a creative economy. I mean, it might be that, but I also think it's about who we are. And to do that, we just need to bring in different types of practices. But who are we? How well do we know each other? This is why the world of social and emotional learning, social emotional skills, I think is just a really powerful vehicle to correct the imbalance that exists between, at schools, you study academics, as opposed to you grow as a whole human being, of which a key part is your academic growth. I just think we've got to expand that in a powerful way.
Thank you. We should definitely finish that book, right? Looking at for those playing at home, Louka and I started a book around the provocation was, as probably very guilty of, and this will lead into the next part that I want to step into, very guilty of overwork. I think I'm exceptional at setting work goals and often really poor at looking at the other fragments of life that kind of make up who you are and your experience. And I remember having this realization that it'd be all great and well to have this amazing legacy of work that I've left behind, but if I'm sitting by myself in my 90s with nobody around me who loves me and who I've loved, then that will have been like a lonely existence, and I'm not sure that the work will have been worth it. the stress and the anxiety and the hours put in. And Nicola, I'd love to sort of dig into that. I think that maybe while we're getting better at managing student wellbeing in some ways, or perhaps we have a greater awareness of student wellbeing, we know our teachers are really struggling in the system, and that we've got this real rise in stress and anxiety and overwork and burnout and lots of factors that I think are leading to really great teachers leaving the system because they're making choices like perhaps the one I did, or reflections off the back of what's truly important in this moment. I'd love to kind of throw to you, what are some ways that schools or that you know of, that schools and leadership teams can kind of start to build the design of teacher wellbeing within the system as well?
Yeah, this is a really tricky conversation, and it's really relevant at the moment. And I think we've all seen the tokenistic self-care list that, you know, flies around the internet. And that's not taking the piss at all. That's, for some people, having a cup of tea and reading a book is really rejuvenating for their soul. Teacher wellbeing is such a complex thing. Like, as a teacher, a classroom teacher wears so many hats in one day. There's this real fatigue of their own levels of compassion. Possibly, you know, it might be tied into their own personality type. They're not very good at considering themselves. They always consider others first. So we see lots of that where teachers are just, they forget about themselves. They forget to eat lunch. They don't consider themselves. And teachers are such a vital part of our fabric, and the role of a teacher is so important. It's completely undervalued in Australia, unfortunately. Where I've seen it done well, I have seen, this is tricky. Okay, it's starting out where some schools have places, staff rooms, staff gardens. So on campus, there's space and time for teachers to reconnect with self, that capital S, self. There's, you know, those end of term offerings where there might be a choice where teachers can do things for themselves, but they're all still things that I'm going to say it, they tick a box. We're doing this, we're offering teachers this. It's not systemic yet. It's not part of our schools, the processes that are set up. Unfortunately, I think we'll get there because we'll lose all of the fantastic teachers to, you know, ill health or frustration because it's just not valued in our place. The only other thing I wanted to say was I spent a lot of time teaching in faith-based schools, and I was always in charge of teaching the difference between spirituality and religion. And as an English trained teacher, I always came back to the root of those words. And spirituality comes from a word, spiros, which means life, to breathe life, what gives you life. Religion comes from a word, religios, which means binding. So religion can be your spirituality. Religion binds people together with the common faith. So for humans to feel alive, they need to attend to this part of them, their spirituality. For some people, that's taking a walk in the forest. For others, it's having a swim in the ocean. For others, it's reading a book, doing yoga. And I think that broad sweeping, this is wellness for you as a teacher, this checklist is wellness for you, is really frustrating for some people because they don't find wellness in a yoga class or a flower arranging class or whatever is offered to them.
Thank you. Louka, I'm going to let you sort of add to that as well, but I just wanted to prompt everyone that's in the room. We've got sort of 10 minutes left. If there are questions that you'd love to drop into the conversation, like please feel welcome to drop those questions in either to one or both of the lovely humans in front of me. But Louka, any thinking on that as well around this piece of teacher wellbeing?
Yeah, I'll just build off what Nicola's spoken to. There's something pretty frustrating about saying you're not looking after yourself well enough. the responsibility is yours to be well. Now that might be in part true, but it does nothing to change the conditions under which educators work. And so this is always about shift, it's redesign, it's well-being by design. I liked your point before, Nicola. It's about the intentionality that we have. And, you know, if you're a school leader, and I know there's at least one on this call, that also starts with you as the culture, I use the word cultural architect of the environment. You know, it's the conditions under which we function. And then, of course, you think about the way that systems actually, they constrain so much of us, I think. And we have all these constraints. Teacher burnout is a real thing. And I think it's a massive problem to talk about student well-being, because I think we should just talk about how do we change from a school to a well-being ecosystem, right? Which is, again, more just, you know, jargon. But the whole idea then is like, if you're a human being and you're in this thing that we call an institution, which we've decided to use the arbitrary word school, you know, what actually happens when you're there? And rather than having to do the yoga class or undertake the contemplative practice that you, whatever you like, I really like that distinction as well on the etymology of spirituality and religion, Nicola. But, you know, really, rather than us to have to take a break from our lives, like I'm just waiting for that weekend so that I can endure, like, could we be bold enough to redesign the organization so that it was more human from the beginning? And there'll be very tangible things that would change because of that. Things like, rather than having a deficit view, we'd bring a strength-based view. We wouldn't talk about behavior management anymore. We'd talk about restorative justice. You know, these kind of transitions we'd see, we'd move towards more agentic environments where there's a higher sense of autonomy, belonging, and engagement that leads to an increased velocity of mastery. You know, that we are going to have to learn through life. It's not learn to earn and then work, or learn to work and then work to earn. It's learn to work and learn for the rest of our lives, whether we like it or not. So those are kind of my reflections, Nick. But I do really like the idea that when we sit down, virtually or otherwise, let's hope it's in person as soon as possible for lockdown colleagues on this call, you know, as a staff, do we undertake these practices that we know actually have an evidence-based impact? You know, do we take a mindful moment? Do we re-presence ourselves? Have we been taught breath work? I mean, there's an entire field. You don't have to go to Wim Hof to like sit in an ice bath. You just have to read James Nestor's groundbreaking book, you know, Breath, the Science of a Lost Art. You know, these practices we should be armed with for this chaotic world that we find ourselves in, you know, saturated with information. And yet we're still being measured, you know, based on how impactful have we been with 30 young people, all of whom are really unique and diverse, and what are their narrow achievement outcomes, as opposed to how do we just be so much more holistic about that? You know, lots of great tools that we can utilize, for example, like check-ins like iYarn is a really good one. There's a whole range of other ones that are, again, it's like, how are you doing right now? How are you feeling? How connected are you? Great. When we attend to the affective side, we know that we're going to think better. The affective neuroscience world, you know, and I'm a mad nerd, and it's just really, if you look at that, like where we are on that edge, it's trying to embed that at the system level so that all of us as human beings that choose to educate in some way can be liberated. And by that liberation, we actually have the same environments created for our learners as well. We should be informing upwards and liberating downwards. Again, that's paraphrasing Professor Michael Fullan. I don't know. There's enough of me ranting along, Nick. Just jump in and stop me.
You know, I'm a big fan of your rants. So I'm going to dig into a couple of questions that have come up. But I remember working at a school in Sydney and being walked into, there was a staff morning tea that was happening at the time. And I sort of slipped in the side with, you know, the educators that I was working with and sort of helped myself to the Cheerios and the sausage rolls, because clearly that's why you're there at the staff morning tea is to get the mini sausage rolls. And the principal stepped up to kind of address the staff. And this principal was talking about how they'd implemented a new policy and it was a private school. And I mentioned that in the context that there's a fee paying element, which I think can make the relationship between the school and parents sometimes complex in that. But I remember this particular principal saying that I know there had been a lot of backlash and that had resulted in a spike in the number of emails that teachers were receiving with regards to this particular policy change. And I remember listening to the principal say, I want you to stop replying to them and I want you to start forwarding them to me. This was a policy change that we made at a leadership level, and we've disseminated enough information about that policy shift to our community in order to make them aware of why. Too much of your time that should be spent with your families is being spent paraphrasing the policy documents that we've already issued to our school community. So I'd like you to forward them to me and then I'll handle them from there. And I remember watching this particular piece of leadership and going, oh, what's interesting to me about this is that the principal had identified something that was causing stress to the staff. And rather than say, oh, here's a sentence for you all to reply back with, or here's a paragraph, just actually went, you know what, I can cut this off. I can actually completely alleviate this piece of stress, this small piece of stress from my staff. And in doing so, also made it clear that the principal didn't feel like the staff should be replying to emails after 6 o'clock at night. Just made this whole conversation around, look, email shouldn't be taking up your home life. And this is something that I want to put out there. So I think to kind of come back to some of the conversations that we're having, I'd be really curious for leadership teams to use data, which is about what we'll dig in to finish off in a second, use data to identify what the sticking points are for educators around stress, but then actually use that data to inform systemic shifts within the school that actually address some of those elements. If we know that week 8 and 9 are the worst weeks in a term for teachers because every single assessment task is issued in week 7 and due in week 9 and reporting is due in week 10, why do we condense? Why do we put all of our assessment within this 1 3-week period in order to create this almost untenable space for students from a stress point of view and teachers from a stress point of view? How do we actually marker these moments and then actually look at, well, what do we have to do and what can we actually shift, and really shake some of these industrial models that we've embedded within our systems simply because they've been done by every school before this moment. We don't have to do things the same way moving forward. Why do we continue to propagate this same stuff? And I think there are questions from a leadership point of view of both students and teachers. Lots of surveys happen, right? How are you feeling? What's stressing you out? But what are we doing with this data? How are we actually distilling that information into tangibles and then actioning those on behalf of the school? Because I think there's a degree of frustration from both students and teachers about the fact that, yeah, I get asked all the time about what worries me, but then nothing changes. It's, I get a paint and sip class on a Friday afternoon in week 10, but essentially all of the elements in weeks 7 to 9 that stressed me out exist in the next term and the term after that and every term after that. And so I do think that there's a call out around, why are we still doing the things that we're doing if they're not serving anybody who's in this system that we're playing in at the moment. I want to dig into this question, which I think is really critical. I know we're running short on time, and if you need to jump out, do so. But I do think this is important. I think teachers are often fearful of collecting data because they're worried about what it will look like. And so how do we, and Nicola, I might throw to you for this one, how do we create, and I'm going to remodel or reframe the word data to story. How do we capture the story of what we're doing within our schools so that we can work out what's working and what's not from a student or from a teacher point of view? What are some of the ways that we can actually sense check that what we're doing is working in order to inform perhaps doing things better?
Yeah, this is a really great question because this well-being idea being a responsibility of a school is considered new and risky, and we're just an academic place. We don't concern ourselves with social and emotional wellness. So the first thing a very conservative place would ask for is data or science to back any change to tradition or process. And the way we get that is through data or story. So I completely understand the requirement for that, so that we're making informed changes. The gold standard in research is pre and post sort of measurements when there's an intervention, such as a public health intervention, you measure before and after.
And what sort of stuff would you measure, I guess, in this case, if we were talking about where do you start to kind of create those to benchmark those markers of pre and post?
Yeah, so there's this, and the fact that there are school chaplains or counsellors on campus now, they are an untapped resource in terms of resources like there's a student report, a youth self-report survey that is so useful for understanding the world of a young person and what is concerning for them socially and emotionally. That also has a teacher and a parent version. They would be ideal because they've been used before. So what we're looking for, we're not reinventing tools of measurement, we're using tools of measurement that have been used before. And so therefore what you get from them can be compared to data that exists in Australia or globally. And I did see the other part of that question being that's just asking for teachers to do another thing. And I absolutely agree that time is always an issue in schools. But if it's important, which I hope it is, it gets outsourced. There are people, experts in this field to do that for you. And if it's going to be important in your place, then you invest. It's an investment.
And I think, Nicola, I guess if there's been a historical context within the school where, surveying has been done, but it hasn't gone anywhere, I think that contributes to a culture of why should I? But effectively, if that feedback loop is being, reflected back, I think, with actionables for staff, I feel like there's a value proposition there for teachers and students to invest in that space as well.
Yeah, and that I see that all the time. And it, the schools that have been around for 100 years, of course, there are teachers there who have been there for up to 30 years. So this won't change. There is that sense, and it's a constant headbutt against barriers, but that's what change is, isn't it? Patience and persistence.
Yeah, unfortunately, right? Like it's pushing through that uncomfortable to get to the other stuff. I want to throw one last question to you as we finish off. We've got some teachers here and obviously a bunch of others that'll watch this later. Where would you send them to if there was one place for them to go, something to read, something to listen, something to watch? Like what would be the one place you would send a teacher to perhaps learn or read more or know more about this space? You can say more than one if you're struggling.
No, I'll say read a book, and it's called The Whole Brain Child. To understand cognitively the neuroscience behind brain development and understanding what's going on, what informs that behavior when you're at your wit's end, at the end of the day, when there's been too much, and you can understand why that child is choosing to be like that.
Thank you. Louka?
Gosh, that's a tricky question. Rather than saying here's the one thing, because there's lots of places you could go, Castle, Greater Good Science Centre, Character Lab, like there's lots of little practices you can utilize. I think the question is, the one thing, the one resource is you. When are you at your best? Have you slowed down enough to really feel what the big barriers are in the way? And some of those might be structural barriers. In fact, they definitely are, because of the way that this non-human system continues to manifest on us humans, right? And so that's the opportunity for design. And it's funny that even with wellbeing interventions, we're intervening. Why? Because it's a recognition that what we have built is not fit for purpose yet. So it's why this idea of redesign, as opposed to improvement within the current paradigm, frankly, I don't think any of us have any time for that. The question is, how do we improve towards a new paradigm? And that means invention, or to be more provocative, maybe just things like remembering. There's lots of great examples of cultures that continue to operate in sustainable ways and have endured for tens of thousands of years. And we're trying to knowledge our way out of this and creating a program logic and doing a double-blind randomized controlled trial and then finding what the research is. These things have their place, but they're not enough because we don't do anything with that information. We don't change. So I would start with self. Who are you? What do you know? What can you do with what you know? When are you at your highest form of contribution? And what barriers are in the way of that right now? Time, structural challenges, and also lifestyle challenges, right? Particularly if you've been locked down for a significant period of time.
Awesome, thank you. And for those, we've sort of referenced Greg Miller and St. Luke's Catholic College, obviously because he's joined today. I would advocate actually looking for the life design program that St. Luke's is running, which is some purposeful space for young people to use design thinking principles to kind of imagine their future pathways and their future self. It's a really innovative piece of curriculum and a really purposeful piece of and whole school approach that I think touches on some of the elements that we've spoken to today. So highly recommend you check that out too. I just want to say thank you to Nicola and also to Louka for your time this afternoon. And I mean, that just flew and we're a little bit over time. So thanks to everyone who's hung around for an extra 10 minutes. But I think your authenticity as educators and then also the experience that you have makes for such an interesting conversation. And I know that we could have continued to chat for probably another hour if we'd been allowed to. So thank you both. We'll make sure that we've got links in this post live learning follow-up so that you can engage with the work that both of these amazing humans do. And I'll also harvest any other links from them that they'd like shared with you all as well. From me and on behalf of Future Anything, thanks for joining us today for live learning. Our next live learning next month, we're touching into something that's very important to me. How do we design curriculum with joy for young people? So if that's something that is your jam, then stay tuned as we release the date and a very, very cool guest for this piece as well. So I think coming into the back year as we start to look to 2022, I think if we could hold one word in our hands as we're designing learning experiences for young people and also for us at the front of the room, I hope it's joy. So thank you for your time. I hope you have a joyful evening, whatever you're up to. And I look forward to catching you all for our next live learning. Thanks to Louka and also to Nicola.
Thank you, Nick. And thank you,
you.
colleagues. Keep up the great work.
Thanks, guys.